Welcome, Benjamin Wallace, to our follow-on of our previous Fireside chat. We had a couple of reactions and also thought about the previous chat, and there were a couple of questions remaining that I would love to discuss with Ben, who has done a tremendous job with his recent book on this topic of Satoshi Nakamoto and the origins of Bitcoin. You find the descriptions of his book and my book in the description of this video. So let's kick off. We have aligned a couple of questions, and hopefully we have the time here to go to at least some of them. So one intriguing question I find is, who is not Satoshi Nakamoto? In the sense that we had a couple of people, probably for fun and some very seriously, claiming that they were Satoshi Nakamoto, as well as we have followerships of many people who want to see certain people being Satoshi Nakamoto. So Ben, can you tell me, when you see these names, when would you say, okay, they're definitely not Satoshi Nakamoto? What are criteria you would apply?
Hello, Jens. All right. Well, I think I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to name two people that I think we can be confident are not Satoshi Nakamoto. One of those is, of course, Craig Wright, the longtime self-proclaimed Satoshi, known to his detractors as Fake Toshi, and officially declared by a London court last year not to be Satoshi, to the point where the court ordered Craig Wright to post on his website that Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto. And even without the court ruling, we could spend hours explaining other reasons why Craig Wright is not, in fact, Satoshi Nakamoto. The other person I'm confident is not Satoshi Nakamoto, who has been put forward as a possible candidate, is Elon Musk. Again, I could go on about why I don't think he's Satoshi, but the simplest way, I think, to debunk the idea is that, do we really believe that someone who literally paid other people to play a video game to boost his score, to impress other people into thinking that he was better at video games than he actually is, do we believe that that same person would not leap to take credit if he in fact had been the inventor of Bitcoin? Finally, I want to say this. The onus is not on people to prove who is not Satoshi. It's on people to prove who is Satoshi. And there's a line I like from the late Christopher Hitchens, and he was talking about belief in God, but he said, that for which no evidence is asserted does not require evidence to be dismissed. And when I say evidence asserted, I mean more than coincidences, like someone codes in C++, or someone knows cryptography, or someone was on the cypherpunks list, or someone showed personal habits of paranoia. That's not evidence. Those are circumstantial signs and cues. But anyone coming forward and saying that someone like Elon Musk is Satoshi needs to do more than line up a bunch of coincidences, because one thing that becomes clear, I think you and I have both learned in our quests, is that things that seem like rare coincidences are often not that rare. They're only rare if you have not really looked at the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, like for example, and I want to be a bit provocative, right? This case of Craig Stephen Wright. For me, it's more a case of what was on his mind. I mean, it must be very crazy to sue. I mean, it's not so crazy. Maybe you just see that as a little bit of fun to say you're Satoshi Nakamoto, right? And just say it. The legal perspective is another thing because usually in the court, you have to show, like, if you sue somebody for pretending to be somebody else, usually that goes about a damage to your reputation, to your income, whatever sponsorships and so on, that you claim a certain damage. This particular case is interesting because Satoshi Nakamoto didn't come out of the woods, right? I initially thought that guy has an interest. Maybe that whole thing was set up to kind of make Satoshi Nakamoto come out for whatever reason, right? But that evidently didn't happen. I mean, there was, I think, one email or so that we don't know whether it was really from Satoshi Nakamoto that showed up at some stage, but that wasn't really taken as firm evidence. So for me, the story is what was Craig Wright's motivation other than the publicity and possibly some whatever promotion of his alternative Bitcoin,
Well,
right?
it's I have a short. Can I briefly
Sure,
answer that?
sure, sure.
Well, before Craig Wright was publicly discussed as Satoshi, he was telling the Australian tax officials that he was Satoshi. So that is the answer. He was in a huge tax jam in Australia, and it was a convenient fiction for him to claim that he was Satoshi and to claim that he had mined all this Bitcoin, and that's where all this supposed money uh, that was missing or that the tax officials couldn't find, that's where it was. It only later became, I think his motivation changed, but I think that would explain very easily his early claims to be Satoshi, which he was only doing privately and to the tax officials.
Yeah, I mean that's a long story. I mean, it seems like he asked some very prestigious writer to accompanying him, and that was paid by the company that
That was
essentially
years
then
later. Years
support.
that was years later. This was back in 2012. He was 2013, 2014. Andrew O'Hagan, the writer you're referring
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
only enters the picture in 2015.
yeah. Okay, but it's still crazy. I mean, it seems like Craig Wright had some insight into legal matters. I mean, he pointed that out actually in the 2000 in the few records that you find on him on the internet, on discussion fora and news groups and so on. He claimed that he had deep legal insight, so it would have been very naive to think that you get away with that story just based on, and I personally communicated with him. He always told me that he will pull out some relatives, right? Who will, and he did that eventually in court. That he thought that his, let's say, older uncle or so would come up and say that whatever he always thought that he would have been that, and that's quite naive that you have like non-technical people kind of certifying such a big claim for you. But maybe we should not spend our time here on this guy too much. As you mentioned, that has been solved. I mean, Elon Musk was for me definitely a person who, let's say, if it had been free for it, if he hadn't been juggling, too many other things, I think like the Bitcoin white paper essentially came out when he had his critical launch of that Falcon 1, or I think it was called rocket. If that had gone in bust, gone bust essentially and exploded again. I think he, at that very stage, that was evidently also the middle of the financial crisis, where raising further funding for very adventurous startups would have been very difficult, right? And Tesla wasn't at the in shape that is nowadays, right? They didn't really have any cars that were competitive to conventional cars. So definitely he was involved in the cypherpunk scene. I think he also showed that he could be coding. He was evidently involved in PayPal, plus of course Tesla and StarX. So that's a different thing. I think he just he I actually think he could have done it, but he was too much into other things that is out of question, right? But don't you think like when going back to the question who is not Satoshi Nakamoto, I mean, you certainly needed to have certain skills at very advanced level to do it, right? What kind of skills would you think or would you associate with the real Satoshi Nakamoto that he definitely needed to wield in order to pull off Bitcoin, as most people think, or at least a significant portion of people think on his own?
I mean, one of the things I think is most interesting about Satoshi in terms of sort of skill, but also motivation is how many people in 2008 and early 2009, when launching, something that could have gone nowhere, that was a very experimental project, that in fact was initially kind of ignored, largely by the cryptographers to whom he announced it. Um, who had the motivation to be extremely, to show sort of perfect operational security at that stage when all they're doing is launching this fringe experiment that might go nowhere, and not only had the motivation but had the skills to do it in 2008, in 2009, and why did they make those choices and you know take such care not to be traceable?
Yeah, that sounds to me, and I think we touched base on that in our previous chat. It's one of these superhuman properties, right? You would if you were to set this up, let's say, as a startup, right? You would not want to do that on your own. You would want to have like somebody looking after the security, somebody the coding, somebody managing the overall project, somebody looking into the pseudonymity protection. So that is in addition to his closed mouth attitude for which must have been like now several years when he was active on it, plus now the post-Bitcoin period from his perspective. Yeah, that's certainly hard to imagine that there would be anybody even handling all this at the same time. And the whole setup was very sophisticated. That wasn't like you just register an email address or a web address, on a regular internet service provider. It's really like a very complex thing that is hard to believe that a single person, as you said, without the certainty that that would become a runner. That's very hard to find. I also find though I've been in coding on and off for essentially 40 years now, right? So I know a little bit C++ plus plus and so on. I would say that most people, I met a lot of people that are much brighter than me, right? And they can learn these things very quickly. I don't think like for somebody who's very brilliant in math and maybe had a little computer experience and C++ plus plus coding would be the only thing missing, then that's doable for these super bright high flyers,
Right.
right? The other thing is the experience. And if you look at, I mean, we have mostly this technical talk by Satoshi, which is another feature, right, that he
Mm-hmm.
never really got emotional or too personal or something like that. So staging that would be also amazing. But what you cannot pretend is the ease that he handled all this computer talk, internet protocols, whatever, cross-platform programming, computer details, which compiler settings. That is not really
Mm-hmm.
smartness, that is experience. And
Mm-hmm.
you do that just, if you know this kind of spontaneously, that's not a sign of intelligence only, but that you have been in the field for several years. So it's like speaking a language, right? When it comes
Mm-hmm.
natural, when you don't have to fight for every word and so on. Some people do it faster than others, but to have this ease of speaking about it, that he seemed to never really struggle when somebody threw a word or a terminology in there that, even though I'm not alien to computers, I would have to look up. And I don't mean only cryptography, like certain details on the internet protocol and on what to do with Linux and of course his main development platform was Windows, which was also a bit unusual for people in the scene. But this experience that he did have some routing into this kind of security coding, into
Mm-hmm.
internet protocol coding, into distributed systems and so on. I think that is nothing that you could talk with ease about, like kind of almost spontaneously answering these questions and never asking too many questions on what they mean or so in return.
Yep.
And he even said that he programmed actually at some stage that he programmed like electronic transactions years ago. That was something that resonated always in my mind. Of course,
Hmm.
it can all be fake. I
Right.
mean, everything you put down on an internet news group or something like that. Of course, can in theory be just part of a bigger plot, but the plot, it's already very big, as we stressed before, right? This superhuman thing. So it probably does have for every human being some boundaries that you cannot keep all that in mind. So for me, it's a lot like, for example, with even though I don't want to delve too far into it, one sentence I noticed with Craig Wright, for example, that made me show eventually that he's not Satoshi Nakamoto is a very simple thing in computing, right? So he was asked in the courtroom, what is an unsigned integer? And anybody who is coding knows that unsigned integers are all over Bitcoin source code, right? Because essentially, like the tokens are integers, so not floating points, so comma or like fractional values, and that's so deep in Bitcoin that you don't have any negative Bitcoin assets, right? So it has to be unsigned. That means positive numbers only. So even that, I mean, of course, if you haven't programmed for quite a while, I sometimes, don't program for a couple of years and then I start again. You forget certain things. But this is so much at the core of Bitcoin and everybody. I mean, you would probably that's something, like swimming or so. You might get worse if you don't train, but you don't, the basic thing you don't unlearn or cycling, right? And so that for me, for example, was kind of the chapter closed when I read that he couldn't really explain it in the courtroom. I mean, even with nervousness and being put on the spot and so on, you could still stumble a few words and kind of make it kind of like very clear to people.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if this is what you were referring to when you said the Satoshi talking about programming payment transactions years earlier, but this may be what you're talking about. There was a quote at some point where he said, "Oh, years ago, I worked on on escrow and
Yeah,
promissory notes,
exactly.
and
Hmm?
yeah, I mean that is just not something that, for instance, I can imagine Peter Todd as a 21-year-old art student ever writing.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
um,
These kind of things that usually
yeah,
at sorry for to interrupting you. These things like, for example, the mindset, right? I mean, you don't like there's not that many people who even thought about inventing a cryptocurrency at the time. Of course, there was this circle of cypherpunks, and that was an essential element, but most academics wouldn't have been that desperate. I mean, taking these extreme measures, they would have written a paper and maybe started a company, and that happened a lot actually in the 90s and also early 2000 until regulators stepped in and that dried out a little bit. But to be so desperate to take yourself out for 1 2 years and then after publishing Bitcoin for another, let's say 2 years, about um, I don't think there were too many people who had that mindset, and that doesn't come from one day to the next, right? You have to grow into that
yeah.
to develop that strong will, that resolve to pull that off. That is not like you just randomly run into a conference presentation and oh yeah, they're talking cryptocurrencies, interesting. I mean, maybe you read a paper after that, but you don't take yourself literally, I guess, pretty much out of business or sacrifice your entire spare time to embark on that journey, right? So there has to
Yeah.
be like somebody, as you mentioned, Peter Todd or so, it's people who were too young to even, if you're young and you weren't born with a golden spoon in your mouth, right? You don't have so many things that you are annoyed at the entire financial system, right? Like most people when they're young, they're not really running a rage against the Federal Reserve or money printing. You have other problems, right? You whatever need to pay for your college and want to go on a vacation with your girlfriend and you would be angry, whatever, at the bank not giving you a credit for like some fun expenses or so. But so I think that there needs one criterion would definitely be that you must have immersed and emotionally attached very strongly to this kind of rant against centralized, centrally issued currencies like the US dollar or pretty much anything that where the money printing is controlled by what at least the cypherpunks perceive like political intentions and so on. That's what I think. Do you have any more of these hard criteria where you say, okay, if whatever, if they haven't been
Right.
immersed or didn't program that well, like
Right.
that they couldn't be Satoshi Nakamoto?
Well, certainly, I mean, to your point, someone, at a minimum who has thought about monetary theory, I mean, even the idea of having a capped money supply. But a third thing, and I don't know if I would quite put this in the category of like a hard criterion, but it's something to think about, and that is the sort of some of the cryptographic choices that Satoshi made. And there's been this conversation about was Satoshi a skilled cryptographer or not. And some people have said, oh, he wasn't using cutting edge cryptography. There were much more advanced algorithms he could have used and methods, et cetera. And I think there was a cryptographic savvy that showed a certain worldliness, and as Amin Gunsir has said, like experience with adversarial use cases. Because the decision to use the sort of double scrambler in the creation of Bitcoin addresses, using two different algorithms, one American, one European, suggests someone with sort of real world savvy about the potential problems that could arise in the sense of whether or not a Secret Service had a back door, or how if one got broken at some point, what could they do to shore it up? And instead of using the less newer, more cutting edge things, but which don't have the tried and true track records of maybe some of the older algorithms, I think that tells us something.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I asked a few like colleagues of mine in a sense, like academics. I mean, I'm not a cryptographer myself. I just read all the stuff to a certain extent, kind of while during my research. But it's actually quite split, right? There's very established cryptographers. I mean, all of them agree that he wasn't a cutting edge cryptographer, which also Satoshi never claimed. I mean, he even said he asked people. He said like that. That was one of the things where he even said a little bit like I don't remember the exact phrasing, but essentially he said I didn't know and had to ask others. So he
Mm-hmm.
never really bragged that, which is also a certain criterion because usually if you're like a top-notch cryptographer, you don't want to show up weak. You don't really want to be the one who would be asking questions. You don't want to admit that. At least that's, I mean, of course you can pretend that and so on, but I mean, it's typically something, you want to appear strong in
Mm-hmm.
your core competence. So you wouldn't admit that normally. I mean, of course, it's again not a hard criterion. But yeah, but I think that the opinions are very split. So I talked to some top cryptographers who know much more or endlessly more about these things than myself, and they disparage Satoshi, saying that was like an undergrad student, and others, from pretty much top universities say, I asked them, like, look, could you have put this together? Not only but they were mostly referring to the technical part,
Mm-hmm.
essentially the so-called Satoshi or the Nakamoto consensus. And they said, no, I wouldn't. I was in the field. I worked on topics very close to them, to these kind of things. I was also interested in electronic cash, but I would have never arrived at this. I'm not sure whether that politeness or modesty or so, but it sounded very honest to me. And others said, yeah, that Bitcoin was so trivial from a cryptographic perspective that I wouldn't even have bothered touching such a topic because it's full of flaws and he didn't do the things that could have been done there in terms of privacy and so on. So that is a very I think there's a lot of vanity and pride. Like if you have worked, I mean, that's something that drew me actually into this. That in most research fields, if you talk about Nobel Prizes now in science or so, right? Usually there's a big fight for the merits because usually it's not like a single person really. It's one person or two people receiving a Nobel Prize, but there's usually a lot of fighting in the background and like I also did something in this and so on. So everybody wanted to be in there. And here in this case, it's not another professor or so, right? It seems like also from what I gather as an academic, not in this field, but in others, that seems to be a rising star who wasn't, at the time at least, established, right? In a sense, he wouldn't get the big talks and the name would just be, okay, maybe you know him a little bit, but usually the silvernecks, right? They try to establish their respect, their role, their superiority, and you don't want if you were like a silverneck, academic silverneck, right, at the time, and you have been working on, let's say, electronic cash systems, and you failed, which is normal in science, right? The failure is not anything, to look down on. But you certainly don't want a very junior guy suddenly showing you how the Holy Grail is found, right? So that psychology is actually quite interesting. May I just ask you another question? So you worked so much and you have been involved in the field probably in looking for the creator of Bitcoin for such a long time. So why do you say is it so difficult to find the real person behind the pseudonym, or some people say the team behind it? Why has, you have started that, I think, in 2011, as far as I can recall. So what are actually the difficulties, maybe the nice difficulties, because maybe it's good that we cannot really identify that person. I would be interested in your stance at that.
Well, I think it tells us, well, let me put it this way. So, my training is I'm a reporter, somewhat investigative, but not exclusively that. And most stories, really all stories other than this one, behave in a similar way when you try to look into them, right? You start talking to people, maybe they're kind of at the fringes of the story or the subject, but they kind of lead you to the next, sort of the concentric rings that surround your topic. They lead you kind of to the next inner ring, and you sort of circle in on the center of the story, right? Like with the first set of interviews lead you to the next set, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually you kind of figure out who really knows something. And every story behaves this way. I mean, and that's how reporting works basically. And the Nakamoto story didn't work this way and does not work this way. It doesn't seem to have a center. And one explanation for this is that Satoshi Nakamoto is a single person who never told anybody. So there is nobody who could leak the information, even if in an indirect way. There is no spouse who, when they got a divorce, could blab about who she is, right? There is no business partner who, when they had the business breakup, could sue them for half of their net worth. So that could be one reason, that it is an individual, solitary Satoshi, with improbable discretion. And now I'm going to make an analogy to somebody else, and I'm only making the analogy in a very limited sense of this kind of solitary person where no one else knows the secret, and not in any of the other ways, as will become clear. But take the Unabomber, right?
Mhm.
Nobody knew other than the Unabomber what the Unabomber had done. Now, eventually, what did him in was a kind of stylometry, in that, when his manifesto was published in the Washington Post, his sister-in-law read it and thought it sounded like her brother-in-law, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for the Unabomber. But so I think we have to entertain the possibility of someone like that. I think we need to entertain the possibility of, which we discussed last time at some length, an intelligence agency, which would be another scenario where, secrets are kept all the time by groups and without ever being learned by anyone in the outside world, at least until they're declassified decades later. And then a third possibility, but again, it would be maybe a variation on the Unabomber, model, would be that they were solitary, they didn't tell anyone, but then they also died, which made it easier for that secret to stay secret. And those, to me, are the three likeliest scenarios, because the secret has not been revealed. And a fourth possibility, but that I consider less likely than any of those, is that certainly that it's a group outside of an intelligence agency that just has shown not only superhuman discretion, but also superhuman harmony and a lack of, any kind of discord that would lead someone to start leaking the secret. Or an individual who just is a complete monk, and a monk of such discipline that they've been able to never take credit, never touch the wealth, never even try to impress someone they were courting, romantically by bragging. I consider that the least likely because it runs so counter to human nature.
And would you think that it's possible, like a lot of people discussed the theory that he might have obliterated any evidence in a sense of these keys, or they might have whether either intentionally or accidentally. Even though I think we touched that last time, why wouldn't he have public or well on the blockchain essentially done the whatever burning of the keys and so on? He could have done that pretty much anonymously. But there's still the option that he couldn't even prove himself unambiguously that he's Satoshi Nakamoto, given that he would have irreversibly destroyed passwords and in particular the keys that we typically associate with his mining activity in 2009. There are a couple of them. So what do you think about that? Would that be like embarrassment? He comes out, he looks maybe quite unlikely, maybe in that monk picture or something similar, that people would say, ah, that cannot be him, like I know that guy. He could have never done it. And then he would stare kind of barehanded. And because then people would say, we only believe you if you show us you have the keys. And he would not really have them anymore, right? They're just gone and are, as the audience well knows, they're not reproducible. If once they're gone, they're gone.
I mean, if that's the case and they can't cryptographically prove it and they irreversibly destroyed all of the kind of documentary evidence, including, their emails to Adam Back, et cetera, back in 2008. But for some reason, they suddenly became motivated to, be recognized as Satoshi Nakamoto. I still think that person would be able to tell a coherent and unfalsifiable story that would buttress the claim, ranging from here's what my initial inspiration was. Here are the conferences I attended. Here are the books I read. Here is the reason why I decided to cite, these papers and not those papers. Here's evidence that at a minimum I knew C++, that at a minimum I had studied, escrow and promissory notes and these things, that I had done this and this. Oh, and by the way, here is a huge writing sample, and I invite every academic stylometrist in the world to compare this with Satoshi's writings. So I think someone could make a pretty convincing case. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be people who would say, you didn't sign the transaction with the Satoshi keys, so I don't believe you. Of course, there would be people like that, but I think that it would be possible for someone in that situation to make a pretty convincing case that they were Satoshi.
But don't you think, like, if you look at even people like you and me, kind of trying to find out the truth, right? I think the overwhelming number of studies have almost like a dogmatic or religious thing, right? There's a lot of people out there who just want to see against any hard evidence, right? That a certain person that they almost religiously or follow, right? Like in a sect or so, they want to see that person. I had a lot of reactions to my videos and my other videos, and and like some of my posts and my book and so on, where people, we were saying like similar arguments that we previously mentioned with Wright and Musk, right? That you just said, look, it's just impossible. That guy wasn't around, or like very hard arguments that that person was probably an early teenager, when Bitcoin came out, and so making it practically impossible. And then I had like answers. I abbreviate that a little bit, but yeah, you're right, but I still believe that this person is Satoshi Nakamoto, right? So I think you would kind of start like how do you say that? Um, like people hating you and going after you and like calling you names and you know maybe if it's a person that's very sensitive to that, maybe that's one of the reasons why he didn't come out. It just says, look, I'm not going to go into that fight. If I lost the keys, I also lost the assets, so the financial gain is gone, and that would be more trouble than gain for me just to stand out there without the keys and without the Bitcoin to whatever buy me uh, secret, like how do you say, not secret service, like bodyguards and all that
Mm.
Elon Musk, for example, has, and these guys in that category of $100 billion assets, right? So if he doesn't have that, he might be very sensitive to this exposure in that hypothetical case that he really doesn't have these coins anymore. But it's an amazing, again, I would call that unhuman. Let's say if it's not the case, or if he destroyed it deliberately, um, that's something very few people would do.
Agreed.
But the other thing is, also on that superhuman thing, I mean, you have altruistic people, right? Like there are some startups, I've just seen on television one guy who sold like a very successful startup, let's say for 100 million, and then gave 90% of the cash to whatever charities or something, that was more or less altruistic for a good cause. I don't remember what, but he gave it away into a foundation that he didn't control, and for a good purpose. But if you create a currency, right, that, I mean, he described it, how this thing gains value. With some goodwill, you even can say that he kind of anticipated some hyper Bitcoinization, as you say nowadays, right? I mean, you can really find that in his 2009 early postings and emails and whatever we have. You can interpret, he didn't call it that, but you know, so if you start something that's essentially comparable to a financial service, it's very unusual that you don't have an interest in money, right? I mean, if you
True.
if you
Yeah.
open maybe a childcare facility, right, or an art
Right.
exhibition or something, you might
Right.
say, okay, or like some rock stars or sports stars, they gotten bankrupt because their business was, I mean, they were making a lot of money, but they didn't have a lot of interest, and whatever, gave the money to trustees, and sometimes they bankrupt them and whatever. But if you create a cryptocurrency and are fully aware of value development, how that could, where it could all go to, and then not having a financial interest, and I think
Hmm.
nobody would have blamed him to keep, a few of the coins. I mean, that's what all other blockchains have, where you have pre-mining and like early adopter programs and so on. So
Yep.
nobody would have blamed him for that.
Yep.
That is quite astounding. This kind of, you start, like, let's say I mean, let's take Musk, right? He started, or was one of the people starting PayPal, and I think all of them, I mean, this so-called PayPal mafia, did something with their money.
Yep.
Nobody kind of, I mean, maybe they later on they gave it to charity or something, and then but that's what I find very.
They didn't move to an ashram, immediately after
Yeah,
cashing
yeah,
out their
yeah,
stock.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Um, yeah, I mean, and the other thing is, if Satoshi Nakamoto, is sort of altruistically motivated, um, why not donate all of their Bitcoin to a good cause? I mean, no one's forcing them to
Exactly.
spend it. So
So let me ask you, like, I have some other questions here. Um, I was thinking, like, maybe the point or the main point, at least for me, is not so much to reveal his civil identity, but actually to answer questions like we have. Why did he do that? So let's have a Gedanken experiment, like a hypothetical case. Like, let's say you had the email address of Satoshi. Let's say one of the old email addresses were still working that Satoshi used to communicate, and we had some confidence that it would be really him who replied to them. And he would say, "Look, I'm not going to tell you my name if you send something there." But then you asked Satoshi, "Okay, but can I ask you three questions? Like in the old fairy tales, that I want to know about you." What Ben? What would you kind of like then ask him? Except
one
for,
might
of
be, do
course,
you,
asking for his name, right? Or anything that leads to his identity.
I mean, I suppose I'd be curious, like, do you believe that, the world will ever know your true identity? I might
Okay.
ask. Um, why have you never touched those coins? Um, and I suppose why not take credit?
Yeah. Don't you think that, I mean, again, that's also my fascination, right? That all sounds very superhuman that you add this aspect, right? The answer to these questions, like you don't expect that to ask any other blockchain founders or so, right? You wouldn't have to ask these questions because they say, no, I have my share, and then I have my pre-mined whatever, Ethereum or Cardano or Cardano ADA or Solana or whatever you have. They all have their shares. There's very few blockchains we actually don't know who set them up. It's public. It's on Wikipedia and so on. So that's an interesting aspect.
What
Um,
would your questions be?
that's a good question. Yeah, like I would say you must have nerves of steel. Let's take, okay, I can understand, like, I know a lot of top researchers in my field, right, who say at some stage, look, I've done enough of this and I need something new, right? These people usually get bored at a stage where maybe I would think, okay, there's still so much to do in this field, right? But they say, oh, it's all like expectable, predictable, the next steps. I set up the whole thing, the idea, and got it to run. And now it's pretty much incremental rather than seminal work, which to some extent holds without being disrespectful to the people who then rewrote essentially Bitcoin in terms of making it more secure, more efficient, and extending functions and so on. But you still, when they had this block size war, I know there's some communication that some people associate with Satoshi, that he dispensed his own opinion, but I mean, he could have done that on the blockchain, right? Supposing he still has the keys. If he had engraved during the block size war in the mid 2010s his preference as a message he would have deposited on the blockchain with a function he actually introduced himself. That would probably have solved the thing, or whether he liked the whatever the SegWit or the Taproot update and certain things that evolved from it. That is very tempting if
Mhm.
that's your brainchild to maybe see that go in the wrong direction, right? So I would say, like, how do you master not so being so persistent, not to not to whatever, like, use your impact, maybe not for your own interest so much that you get more Bitcoin, but that, like, how can you stay so silent? I've never seen any of these people who, as you said, maybe monks, right? but I don't think he was a monk or monk-like person and with a religious mission. I don't think there's any religious mission in Bitcoin or something like that, you know. The other thing is, yeah, what would be your, I call it the eureka moment, right?
Mm.
I had like similar things in my quite much more modest research career, you know, where I had these, at least from my perspective, really good ideas. And that would be interesting for me just from a scientific
Hmm.
perspective. You know, what did you do? Where did you
Yep.
sit? Were you sitting with your dog at a lake and suddenly, you know, like this Newton's apple kind of
Hmm.
equivalent,
Yep.
right? What was your inspiration? What gave you the confidence to, as we discussed earlier, not only start development, but pretty much in at the same time, he must also have decided to be super silent on all his ideas, which is extremely challenging because usually if you have these ideas, a lot of people would be shouting it out, you know, and calling all your colleagues, look, I have this idea, or do a little bit, and then give them a demo, right?
Yep.
What is it? And he like when for example, one thing I think we briefly covered that in our previous chat, um, he didn't seem to have testing, right? And everybody who develops such a software, pretty much like a permaware, in a sense that you should never really change the basic plot of the thing, which actually has never been done so far for 15 years. I mean, that would be the only software probably that has some relevance in the world where, you know, no substantial changes have been done. Of course, there have been improvements and extensions and so on, but essentially the basic principle is still the same, right?
Yep.
It's like the Bible, right? You don't edit the Catholic or Protestant church don't edit the Bible. They might reinterpret it and so on, you know. So how could you have been in, it must have been in 26, 27 or something, you know, that you were so assured that this thing would work that you didn't even bother talking to people about testing.
I mean, he did have code review right before it was released.
Yeah, yeah. Well, after you had written the code,
Right.
but you know,
Yeah.
usually you would like if you were a company, like if Microsoft, you know, you would have like a beta testing where they probably have even
Right.
designated facilities, you know, where every
Right.
little, you know, like every little user, and you would give it to a couple of trusted people, or they have some
Mm.
procedure. So yes, he might have given it. I mean, we know he gave it to Hal Finney, which
And Ray
was probably a
Dillinger.
very
Yeah.
good idea. But even with Hal Finney, I mean, that would be my third question. Why didn't you reach out? I mean, some of the candidates I screened, um, which are my most likely candidate, they might not have been, you know, like buddies with Hal Finney and Adam Back and so on, but they cited them, right? These were known figures. So why did you only essentially reach out to Adam Back at the beginning? Why didn't you try to like when you reached or when this Marty Malmy guy kind of came back to you? I mean, usually and again with all respect to Marty Malmy, that wouldn't be enough for you, right? That was not really a person at the level of himself, right? You would like to have like people with some standing that you kind of know from the scene to look at it. I mean, you wouldn't ha even have to have disclosed your identity, right? But maybe we don't even know that because I have one of my let's say deeper sources. He told me that he was actually approached by Satoshi Nakamoto, but he asked me not to disclose that was done. And I have some people I don't know. They told me that they were approached, but then they didn't really have the chronicle right, you know. So they didn't tell me when it was, you know. So and it was not solid enough for me, you know. Like they kind of, you know, at the time you just got an email, right? And at the time, you know, let's say in 2010, if somebody approached you with Bitcoin, like let's say before you wrote even your article in, I think it was in Wired or so, you know, there wasn't really that much public attention. And actually, in the financial cryptography scene, the Bitcoin topic was taken up quite late.
Hmm.
right? It seemed to be like almost a different community that was outside almost the cypherpunks, or at least the big name cypherpunks, right? That were like the people who were picking it up in 2010, 2011. So that was another miracle to me that he would have be so stubborn and kept his resolve to pull that thing through while seeing that essentially, I mean, I cannot remember a single first row cypherpunk who was, except for Helfinia, of course, who was really into it. I mean, he sent it to
Hmm.
Adam Back and Wei Dai. So the
Hmm.
other two names, I mean, it's a mystery why didn't he knew Nick Szabo because he mentioned him, but he didn't apparently. I mean, we don't know, but apparently he didn't approach him, or Szabo doesn't want to tell us. But I mean, you send it to Adam Back and Wei Dai, and they pretty much didn't respond or weren't interested. That would have been a big frustration, right? I do this thing, the Holy Grail. I think he was aware of that. I mean, that's one thing without bragging. He kind of said, I knew it will work.
Right.
And then the main guys where you really want the approval from, or at least some kudos or encouragement, they're not interested. They're just pointing you, oh yeah, just go to Wei Dai, like and he might know something and I'm out. And don't contact me again. And if you contact me again, then I will not respond, kind of. So that would be one question I have, how he could keep his resolve and motivation and and the sacrifice. I mean, you must have spent hours and hours and hours, to do all the coding and then the testing and you cannot just release a version. So you need to really like look into that very, very deeply to not have any bugs in it and so on. And in that sense, so if we ask, or in addition to the questions, how do you think would Satoshi Nakamoto react? Like, let's say you have identified or are pretty sure that that person is Satoshi Nakamoto, so you have the email address of that person, like under his civil name, so to say. What do you think would Satoshi Nakamoto do if you ask him, look, I investigated your profile, everything points towards you. Um, First of all, how would you approach that person? And what do you think, what would he or they or her or she um, respond if that was really Satoshi Nakamoto?
I think it would sort of depend on, are they a public figure or not? I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto has the benefit of watching this happen over and over again over the past 17 years. And, Satoshi has watched, assuming Satoshi's alive, has watched how other people who have been named as Satoshi have handled it and what the reaction to that was. And so, you know, if it was, let's say, the New York Times and they said we have this dead to rights and we're going to put it on our front page tomorrow, then maybe you react. You maybe I don't know how you react. Maybe you deny it. Maybe you call your lawyer and have them deny it. But if it's just someone out of the blue saying this to you, I think you would ignore it. You just completely ignore the contact and not respond. Or maybe you just say no and that's that, right? I don't think you need to react in any significant way. And the only exception perhaps being if a mainstream news outlet was about to make it public, then maybe you want to, if you accept that it's going to happen and that it's probably going to stick, then you might want to, you know, take a little bit of authorship of the narrative and uh, and not just put your head in the sand. What do you
I
think?
find I find that case again very unique, right? Like going back to something that we started this conversation with. I think this case is unique because we have a completely digital scenario, maybe the first one of interest at least ever, right? Where somebody has kept himself fully digital, right? Pretty much at least to beyond my skill set would be to attach anything physical. Like we don't have any picture, any fingerprint, any stuff you have in let's say criminal cases like murders or something. You have some traces, So have some timing, whatever, when the murder happened and where, and all these things, or DNA, for example, we don't have that. So I might, my hypothesis is uh, coming back to the initial part there. Maybe he's fully confident that nobody can come up with anything that he cannot, and I resort to like intelligence talk, like plausibly deny. I mean that I think the term when you become a spy, I'm not, but I read that, right? One thing like whatever, if you are planted into some scenario under a pseudonym in the real world, of course, at some stage somebody might ask you, like whatever, you're not really the person you're pretending to be. You might be whatever, like being channeled into our system here, into some whatever, like organized crime situation or something like that. And then these spies, as far as I understood, they are trained to plausibly deny. And I think here, if you, I mean, that's what we maybe also a question I would ask Satoshi. Like, there are certain things that show to me that he choreographed the entire Nakamoto figure to be able to plausibly deny and never get, tempted that he releases something that can unambiguously, directly prove his identity. And that's another, let's say, one of these miracles that usually people would not be so easy. I mean, technically, you can think about, yeah, that's possible, but by a single person to set that up from the very beginning, and I think also my theory is that the entire departure, so that this very short time window, right? When I mean, when you came in, he was already gone, like in whatever, what did fall 2011 or so, right? So that whole departure was planned from the outset to kind of minimize his interaction videos, so even the CIA and so on wouldn't have, you know, gotten on his trail because he knew they have programs. So once you're on their like watch list, then they would track all the things, and then even your tour and so on might not be enough anymore when they start collecting everything about you to stay hidden from them, right? So we have this totally digital persona, which is probably staged very deliberately with like a life plan essentially of a departure and coming out of nothing. That and so I think if you now called him or sent him an email, he would probably have full confidence that, similar to what happened here to Peter Todd in that HBO thing or so, that you essentially say, no, it's not me. And then that story would probably come up and then go into nothing, right? Because people would say, yeah, okay, you have a headline for 1 or 2 days, but if you just say, look, it's not me, I was never interested in cryptocurrencies and all that crap, he would probably say, like, bitch even a little bit at Bitcoin or something like that, and you know, turn it down and say, like, it's inferior and it has so many things that so many deficiencies that I
I
could
would
not
never
have them
design
trust.
something so lacking in privacy. Yeah, they would have, all of
Yeah,
that.
he probably has something, and I think due to the super exclusive, as far as I understand, digital nature of this and his short lifetime, he's probably confident enough to dismiss anything, and I don't think what you could put up against him. I mean, it's not a crime to have this, so we have certain investigative mechanisms not at hand, at least not the FBI or so, maybe Secret Services, but they might not have enough evidence or even not interested. And so I think he would probably not react at all, regardless of who knocks on his door. um, that's what but I would love to ask him, Of course, he wouldn't tell me because that would kind of be then of course in contradiction to his anonymity.
I mean, a question I would also ask actually that I'd be interested in, and again, who knows if you'd get a informative answer, but what have you been doing for the last 14 years?
Yeah, he said he moved on to other things.
What are
But
the other things?
yeah,
What do you move on to?
but that's something that I investigated a little bit in my book, right? When I had like and that's also why I tried to put names against Satoshi Nakamoto, like candidates, right? Not so much that I wanted to dox these people, but I wanted to see, okay, like I identify, I mean, there were a couple of super intelligent people that are my candidates, otherwise they wouldn't be candidates. And you really look at what did they do afterwards, and it's not, I mean, if you look at this species, um, that is actually not so hard to find, right? Most of them had, like different stories, like that would, some drifted maybe a little bit into private things after they made whatever 10, 20 million or something like that. Others founded companies, and some of them stayed a little bit closer to, let's say, blockchain. Others, went back maybe to cryptography, made their brilliant
Mhm.
academic career full of accolades and prizes and so on. So I thought that would be more difficult, but there are like pretty much all the candidates, maybe except for one or two, but let's say from 10, maybe eight of them, I would if one of them was Satoshi, they would have no problem, like they probably sold their company or are building it still up, and you know they probably are wealthy enough, maybe not 100 billion, but let's say a few 10 or hundreds or even a billion rich, and so they wouldn't have the need, the financial need to touch their assets and come out as Satoshi Nakamoto, and also not necessarily get the recognition, the fame, because they are, at least in their world, if it's academics or in the business world, actually they have this recognition, right? There are respected people who would be, whatever, being interviewed by CNN or Fox News or so on certain topics, so they don't have this problem that they just sit in a dark corner and nobody asks them anything, because that's quite like for these kind of super brains, they want to show off their expertise, and I wouldn't have too many of my favorites who don't have that option in the post Bitcoin, so in the post Satoshi years, I would say.
Wouldn't you think also that Satoshi, having invented Bitcoin, would want to tackle something extremely ambitious as their next project?
Yes, of course, but that might be ambitious in their own mind, right? So it might not be ambitious in a publicly visible and easily understandable way. Some of them may be thinking like of some technology that you don't see as much on the surface. Let's say if you, for example, invent a new privacy technology that is eventually bought up and channeled into whatever Microsoft Windows or something like that. So it might not be so much in the public eye, and not so easy to explain. Like if you do something in cryptography, I mean, unless it's some uh, world-leading cryptocurrency coming out, it's something that usually doesn't catch public, I mean, in the broad public, the attention. So you would just be known to your circle of experts. That
Right.
might be a few thousand or 10,000 people on the planet. Let's say if it's more like program technology, some function you introduce, or some restructuring of a library that eventually at some stage enters into your Windows or Mac OS or Linux or so, then so they might have this recognition, but it's just not as much visible as an Elon Musk or something like that, where
Right.
you have something, everybody understands a car and everybody understands a rocket and everybody understands PayPal, right? So it might just be under the radar of the broad public, but you're still get your satisfaction out of having done these things. You might not
Right.
need this kind of broad celebration in the public and whatever, becoming a doge, like right hand of the president and so on. I think that might not have to be the case. Look, do you have anything else, or shall we wrap up for today, or
I
you
think
want
we're
to?
good. I think we've covered a lot.
Super. Okay, I thank you a lot, Ben. Again,
Thank
Ben
you.
is normally known as an author as Benjamin Wallace, and I will put his book and the data on him and how you can avail of it, as well as my book on topics very much related to our discussion here in the description of the video. I thank you very much, and maybe you can give us also some comments on YouTube, and we might then have another chat or so to maybe get into that in the future. So thanks again, Ben. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Jens. This was fun.
Talk to you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.